The courthouse was alive with tension that morning, the kind of tension that clung to the air like thick fog, heavy and unshakable. Reporters had crowded the steps outside at dawn, cameras flashing as lawyers swept past them in tailored suits. Inside, the wooden benches filled quickly with townspeople, each one hungry to witness the trial that had shaken their community. Every cough, every whispered word seemed amplified in that packed chamber. The case being heard was no ordinary one. It had the weight of lives ruined, neighborhoods shaken, and justice teetering on the edge of uncertainty. In the middle of all that seriousness, sitting by the prosecution's table, was a large German shepherd, its golden brown coat gleaming under the courtroom lights. The dog was no ordinary pet. It was a police canine, trained not only for patrol, but also as a comfort dog for witnesses who struggled under the crushing weight of testifying. Its steady eyes scanned the room, calm but alert, ready for its handler's slightest command. The sight of the animal in the courthouse added both gravity and reassurance. To most people present, the dog represented loyalty, discipline, and authority. But not everyone in the room saw the canine with solemn respect. A small girl, barely 3 years old, sat fidgeting beside her mother near the back row. Her legs swung freely above the ground, her tiny shoes tapping rhythmically against the bench as she tried to keep herself entertained. Courtrooms weren't built for children, especially not children with boundless curiosity and voices too innocent to be contained. She twisted strands of her hair around her fingers, her big round eyes darting around the room, taking in things the adults had long stopped noticing. Her mother leaned down occasionally to whisper, "Shh, stay quiet." But toddlers are rarely bound by whispers of restraint. The girl's attention had been captured entirely, not by the stern-looking judge, not by the lawyers sparring over motions, not even by the rows of strangers in dark clothing. Her gaze locked on the dog. The moment she spotted the canine sitting stoically beside the officer, she straightened her back and gasped as if she'd just seen a celebrity. At first, she tried to stay quiet, her tiny lips curving into a smile as her eyes never left the animal. The dog turned its head slightly, ears twitching, and that was it. Her patience broke. Without hesitation, her tiny arm shot forward, finger pointing proudly across the courtroom. "Doggy!" She squealed. The sound carried across the hushed room like a pebble breaking the still surface of water. Heads turned instantly toward her. For a moment, there was silence, a stunned, awkward pause where even the judge raised an eyebrow. Then it happened. Laughter. It started as a soft chuckle from one of the jurors, then spread like wildfire. Even the attorneys, so carefully composed until now, allowed themselves small smiles. A bailiff covered his mouth to hide a grin. The tension that had suffocated the room only moments before seemed to ease, if only slightly, all because a child had spoken with the kind of unfiltered joy only a toddler could. The little girl's mother blushed furiously, whispering apologies to those around her, trying to shush her daughter. But the damage, or perhaps the blessing, was already done. The courtroom, which had felt like a battlefield of words and strategies, suddenly carried a warmth it hadn't seen since the trial began. The child had pierced through the formality, cutting into the heaviness with a single word. The judge cleared his throat, a practiced sound meant to bring order back to the chamber. But even he couldn't suppress the twitch of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He adjusted his glasses, tapped his gavel lightly, and said, "Let's continue," his tone far softer than it had been minutes earlier. The dog, however, reacted differently. While humans laughed and exchanged amused glances, the canine's head tilted slightly toward the child. Its ears perked up, eyes sharp, as though something familiar had stirred within it. The handler noticed but dismissed it, assuming the dog was simply responding to the sudden rise in voices. Still, the way the animal seemed to study the child, the intensity in its gaze, it was subtle, but noticeable enough to raise questions later. The girl, oblivious to the ripple effect of her interruption, giggled proudly. She had broken through the grown-up seriousness, and in her mind, that was a victory. Her voice had been heard in a room where she was supposed to stay invisible. Her eyes sparkled as she clapped her hands together softly, still pointing at the K9. Those seated near her leaned closer, some smiling warmly at her innocence. "Kids," one woman whispered to her neighbor, shaking her head with amusement. Another muttered, "At least she lightened the mood." They thought this was the end of it, just a cute memory to soften the edges of a difficult day. But the little girl wasn't finished. Her smile faded slightly as she tilted her head, studying the K9 more closely, as though trying to place a memory. She blinked, her expression shifting from playful joy to puzzled seriousness. Her tiny voice, so clear and pure, rose again, this time without the giggle. "That's the doggy from our street," she said matter-of-factly. The effect was immediate. The laughter evaporated like smoke in the wind. Murmurs spread through the room as people turned back to look at her again. Her mother froze, unsure of what her daughter had just implied. The K9's handler straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced at the dog, then at the child. For a moment, no one knew what to make of it. Was it another childish comment, born from imagination? Or was it something more, something real, something that might matter in ways no one in that courtroom had anticipated? The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The defense attorney raised his eyebrows, half amused, half unsettled. Even the judge paused, tapping his gavel lightly, though his gaze lingered on the child longer than before. The little girl's mother tried to hush her again, whispering fiercely, "Enough, sweetheart. Be quiet." But the toddler wouldn't be silenced. Her eyes never left the dog, her small brow furrowing as if she were recalling something important. At that moment, the K9 gave a low whine, a sound so soft only those close by heard it. The handler frowned, laying a hand gently on the dog's back, but the animal remained alert, gaze fixed squarely on the girl. It was supposed to be an innocent interruption, a toddler's harmless moment in an adult world. Yet, as the silence grew heavier, one truth became clear. This wasn't over. What the girl had just said would echo long after the laughter faded. And though no one realized it yet, her words had set in motion a chain of events that would change the trial and the lives of those involved forever. The murmur of voices lingered after the girl's unexpected declaration. Though the judge had restored order, the room no longer felt the same. Adults tried to shift their focus back to the arguments unfolding at the front of the court, but the weight of a 3-year-old's words clung to them. Meanwhile, the little girl, legs still swinging freely, seemed unbothered by the tension she had stirred. To her, this wasn't a battlefield of justice. It was simply a big, quiet room with stern faces, and most importantly, a dog she swore she recognized. Her mother sighed heavily, cheeks flushed from embarrassment. Bringing a child to court had never been her plan. But when the babysitter canceled last minute, she had little choice. The girl's father worked long hours, and no one else could take her. So she bundled her daughter up, whispered a prayer that she would stay quiet, and brought her along. She imagined crayons, snacks, and whispered reminders would keep her child occupied. She hadn't expected her to notice anything beyond the walls themselves. But that was the thing about children. They notice everything adults overlook. At 3 years old, the girl's world was small, yet endlessly sharp. She remembered the color of the neighbor's mailbox, the creak of the porch steps, the way the night air smelled after rain. Where adults grew numb to details, she lived inside them. Every sight, every sound became a piece of her little universe, filed away in her memory with surprising clarity. And in that memory, the dog in front of her wasn't just any dog. She had seen those sharp eyes before, glowing faintly under the dim glow of a streetlight. She remembered pressing her small hands against the windowpane, peeking out into the night when she was supposed to be asleep. She recalled the sound of muffled footsteps on the sidewalk, a figure moving in the shadows, and beside him, the same dog. Of course, she didn't explain it that way. To her, it was simple. The doggy from our street. Those few words carried more weight than anyone realized. As the trial droned on, the child leaned into her mother's arm, whispering questions only a toddler could ask in such a setting. Why is the doggy here? Why is everyone so mad? Can I pet him? Her mother, frazzled, kept hushing her. But the persistence of her curiosity wasn't unusual. Ever since she could talk, the girl had been the kind of child who tugged at loose threads until the whole sweater unraveled. People often underestimated her. They laughed at her observations, amused at how seriously she seemed to take the world. But beneath her wide-eyed innocence was a piercing honesty, untouched by the filters adults learned to use. She didn't know how to hide truth behind politeness, or how to disguise recognition with doubt. To her, things simply were what they were. And so, while adults dismissed her first words as childish whimsy, her eyes remained locked on the canine with a growing seriousness. She tilted her head, brows furrowed, studying the way the dog sat, the curve of its ears, the black saddle of fur on its back. Her tiny hand tugged at her mother's sleeve again. "That's him," she whispered. "That's the one." Her mother didn't respond this time. She was too tired, too embarrassed, and too focused on the trial to realize what her daughter meant. But a few people nearby overheard. A man in the row ahead turned slightly, his expression softening as he watched the child's unwavering focus. He wasn't laughing anymore. Something in her tone had shifted. It wasn't playful, but certain, as if she were identifying an old friend. The K9, meanwhile, seemed equally drawn to her. Unlike earlier, when it sat stoically beside its handler, its ears twitched at the sound of her voice. The animal's gaze kept returning to the little girl, studying her with the same intensity she gave back. Dogs rarely faked recognition. They lived by instinct, and its instincts seemed suddenly alive. Still, most adults in the room brushed it off. In their eyes, a toddler's perspective was unreliable, too colored by imagination to be trusted. But the quiet pull of her curiosity began to gnaw at them. After all, hadn't history proven that children sometimes saw truths adults were blind to? The prosecutor glanced briefly toward the back of the room, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. The defense attorney, too, shifted in his chair, scribbling a note he didn't share with anyone. The judge, while pretending to focus on the arguments at hand, tapped his pen against the desk absent-mindedly, sneaking occasional glances at the child who had disrupted his courtroom so effortlessly. But the little girl wasn't aware of any of this. Her world remained simple, pure. She swung her feet, hummed softly, and clutched her favorite stuffed toy, which her mother had tucked into her bag. Yet her gaze never strayed far from the canine. To her, this wasn't coincidence. This was familiarity. Her mind drifted back to nights at home when her parents thought she was asleep. She remembered peeking through the blinds, watching shadows stretch across the street. She remembered the sound of a man's voice, low, hurried, unfriendly. And she remembered the dog, sitting perfectly still, waiting beside him. Those images weren't figments of a child's imagination. They were snapshots burned into her memory. And now, in this grand courtroom filled with strangers, the past and present collided. No one realized it yet, but her curiosity was far more than idle distraction. It was the first thread tugged from a tightly woven case, and once pulled, it would unravel connections no adult had managed to see. The little girl didn't understand the weight of her own words. She only knew the dog looked familiar, and her small voice was determined to make sure someone listened. To her, truth wasn't complicated. It was as simple as pointing and saying, "That's him." And as the trial pressed forward, as witnesses argued and lawyers objected, that truth waited quietly in the air, growing heavier with every passing second. For in that moment, the most observant person in the courtroom wasn't a lawyer, a juror, or a seasoned investigator. It was a 3-year-old child whose curiosity was about to shift the course of justice in ways no one could have predicted. The laughter in the courtroom had only just begun to settle when the little girl spoke again. Her voice, though small, carried across the room with the clarity of a bell. "That's the doggy from our street." At first, her words drew a few more smiles. To many, it sounded like nothing more than the imaginative rambling of a toddler, trying to connect the familiar with the unfamiliar. People exchanged knowing glances, as though to say, "How sweet she thinks all dogs look the same." But then came the part that wiped away every trace of amusement. He was there with the bad man. The child's voice didn't waver. It wasn't giggly or playful or uncertain. It was firm, confident, and startlingly clear. The room fell into silence, so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were listening. The bailiff, who had been suppressing a grin moments earlier, froze mid-breath. The jury's heads turned almost in unison toward the back row. The prosecutor lowered his pen slowly, eyes narrowing as the meaning of her words sank in. Even the defense attorney, whose face had been a mask of smug control, blinked in surprise. Only the little girl remained unchanged. She continued to stare at the K9, her small fingers still pointing, her expression serious now, as though she had just solved a puzzle no one else could. Her mother's cheeks turned crimson. "Sweetheart, stop," she whispered urgently, tugging at her daughter's sleeve. She offered frantic apologies to those around her, desperate to hush the child before she said anything else. But the little girl pulled away, wriggling in protest. She had seen the dog before. She knew she had. And she couldn't understand why no one else was saying it aloud. The K9 shifted, its body language changing subtly. Its ears perked high, tail stiffening as its gaze locked onto the child. The handler felt the tension in the leash, a familiar signal he couldn't dismiss. He placed a steadying hand on the animal's back, but the German shepherd's focus never wavered. It wasn't reacting to random noise, it was recognizing something. The judge tapped his gavel, his voice calm but firm. "Order." He leaned forward, peering over his glasses toward the source of the interruption. "Ma'am, control your child, please." His tone wasn't angry, but it carried a weight that demanded respect. "I'm so sorry, Your Honor," the mother stammered, holding her daughter close. She doesn't know what she's saying, but even the judge wasn't entirely convinced. Something about the child's unwavering certainty had unsettled him. Children might exaggerate, but they rarely lied with such conviction. And when they did, they often couldn't maintain the serious tone this girl had just used. The prosecutor stood slowly, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "I realize this is unconventional, but I'd like to request a brief recess." His request wasn't about needing rest. It was about needing answers. The defense attorney scoffed, rising to his feet. "This is absurd. We're not about to let a toddler derail these proceedings. She's a child barely old enough to form full sentences." But even as he spoke, his eyes flickered with unease. He had seen the jury's reaction. They weren't laughing anymore. They were listening. The judge hesitated, tapping his pen against the bench. Finally, he nodded. 15 minutes. Court is in recess. The gavel struck, and the room erupted into whispers. As people stood and stretched, their conversations buzzed with speculation. Some dismissed the girl's words as childish nonsense. Others exchanged troubled glances, repeating her phrase in hushed tones. The bad man. In the back row, the little girl swung her legs again, unbothered by the storm she had created. To her, the truth had been simple. She had seen the dog before, and she remembered the man who stood beside it. It wasn't frightening to her. Not yet. She didn't grasp the gravity of what she had just revealed. She was simply sharing what she knew, the way children often did, with blunt honesty. A canine handler crouched beside his partner, whispering commands to calm the animal. But the dog remained alert, eyes flicking toward the child repeatedly. It wasn't fear, nor aggression, it was recognition. The handler had worked with dogs long enough to know the difference. The prosecutor approached cautiously, leaning down to speak with the mother. "I don't mean to cause you distress," he said gently. "But your daughter, does she often make claims like this?" The mother shook her head, clutching the child close. "She's imaginative, yes, but not like this. She doesn't lie. She's 3. Her voice cracked slightly, betraying her own confusion. She wanted desperately to dismiss her daughter's words, but deep down, she knew her little girl wasn't prone to inventing things out of thin air. The prosecutor nodded slowly. He crouched so he was at eye level with the child. "Hi there," he said softly. "That's a big dog, isn't it?" The little girl smiled faintly. "He's from our street," she repeated, this time with quiet certainty. The prosecutor swallowed, his pulse quickening. He looked to the canine again, then to the handler, who gave a subtle shrug. None of this made sense. Not yet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had all just stumbled onto something bigger than coincidence. The defense attorney watched from across the room, his jaw tight. He scribbled furiously in his notes, muttering under his breath. He knew the danger here wasn't the child's words themselves. It was how the jury would perceive them. Jurors were human, prone to empathy. And the testimony of an innocent child, however unplanned, carried a weight adults couldn't easily dismiss. When court resumed, the judge made it clear, "Let's remain focused. The child's statements will not be considered evidence at this time." His gavel struck, finalizing the decision. But the damage had already been done. The courtroom was no longer the same place it had been an hour ago. Doubt hung in the air, and every glance toward the accused carried new suspicion. The jurors, though instructed to ignore it, couldn't erase the words from their minds. "That's the doggy from our street. He was there with the bad man." The girl had spoken truth as only a child could, without agenda, without fear, without understanding of consequence. And though the trial pressed forward, a silent shift had begun, one that would alter the path of justice in ways none of them yet realized. The accused sat stiffly at the defense table, jaw clenched, eyes darting briefly toward the child, before quickly looking away. For the first time since the trial began, there was a crack in his composure. And somewhere in the crowd, people whispered the same thought. Perhaps the smallest voice in the room had just spoken the loudest truth. The air in the courtroom felt heavier when everyone returned to their seats after recess. The chatter had died down, but the weight of the little girl's words lingered like a storm cloud, refusing to drift away. The judge, though composed, tapped his pen against the desk more often than usual. The jurors shuffled in their seats, some biting their lips, others stealing glances at the child, who had unintentionally taken center stage. And then there was the K9. The German shepherd sat rigid, ears twitching every time the girl's voice rose above a whisper. The dog's eyes stayed locked on her, an unshakable focus that even the handler couldn't fully redirect. It was as though some invisible thread connected them, tugging tighter every time she spoke. The defense attorney tried to resume his questioning with confidence, but the smooth rhythm he usually commanded faltered. His voice lacked its earlier arrogance. Each time he glanced at the jury, he could see it, a doubt planted firmly in their expressions. They had been instructed to disregard the girl's interruption, but instructions couldn't erase memories. At the prosecution's table, The lead attorney sat with narrowed eyes, tapping a finger against his notes. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. He was calculating. A toddler's words weren't admissible testimony, but they had pointed toward something. And good lawyers knew that even a stray thread, if tugged hard enough, could unravel a tightly woven defense. Meanwhile, the mother sat stiffly in the back row, clutching her daughter on her lap, as though keeping her still would undo what had already been said. She whispered hurriedly into the child's ear, promising sweets if she stayed quiet, threatening early bedtime if she didn't. But the little girl's wide eyes never wavered from the dog. For her, the courtroom wasn't a place of rules and strategy. It was simple. She had seen this dog before, and she wasn't going to let the adults ignore it. The judge cleared his throat, bringing the room back to order. "We will proceed as planned," he announced firmly. "Let's not lose focus." But focus was already lost. The prosecutor called forward the K-9's handler as a witness, intending to move the trial back toward official testimony. The officer stood tall, uniform pressed, voice steady as he described the dog's training, its role in investigations, and the reliability of its alerts. He explained that the K-9 had been deployed numerous times during the investigation into the accused, primarily for narcotics detection and patrol assistance. As he spoke, the jurors listened, but many glanced back at the child. Their minds wouldn't let go of her words. "From our street. With the bad man." The image wouldn't fade. The defense attorney rose sharply, eager to regain control. "Officer," he said with a thin smile, "you're telling this court that your dog, though impressive, is simply an animal. And like all animals, it can be mistaken, can it not?" The officer straightened. "These dogs are highly trained. Their instincts are remarkably accurate, but not infallible," the defense pressed, pacing before the jury. "And isn't it true that sometimes what handlers perceive as recognition or alerting behavior is simply coincidence?" The officer hesitated, his jaw tightening. He knew where this was going. The defense turned suddenly, pointing toward the back of the room. "Case in point, a toddler claims to have recognized your dog on her street. Are we truly to believe that a 3-year-old's impression should carry any weight in this matter?" The courtroom stirred. Gasps and murmurs spread quickly. The judge banged his gavel. "Order!" But the damage wasn't in the words themselves. It was in the way the defense attorney had said them. His mockery only highlighted what everyone was already thinking. A child had spoken, and whether they admitted it or not, her words had pierced through their doubt. The prosecutor seized the moment. He rose calmly, voice steady, but his eyes burned with intent. "Officer, can you confirm for this court where your K-9 was deployed during the weeks leading up to the arrest?" The handler flipped through his logbook. "Yes, sir. Several patrols were conducted in the neighborhood where the accused was reported loitering. We logged 3 separate nights near Oakwood Street." The prosecutor nodded slowly, then glanced at the jury. He didn't have to say it aloud. Oakwood Street. That was where the child lived. The connection was undeniable. The jurors shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves until the judge silenced them again. The defense attorney paled slightly, realizing too late that his attempt at ridicule had backfired. Meanwhile, the little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve once more. She whispered loudly enough for nearby rows to hear, "I told you." That's when the bad man was outside. The courtroom froze again. The handler's head snapped up. The K-9, almost on cue, let out a low, rumbling growl. Not loud, but enough to be heard by those nearest. The sound wasn't random. It was recognition. The judge's face hardened. "Remove that child if she cannot remain quiet," he ordered sharply, though his own voice carried an unease he couldn't hide. The bailiff moved toward the back, but hesitated. Even he wasn't sure if silencing the girl was the right thing to do. She wasn't causing a disturbance anymore, She was telling truths that no one had expected to hear in this room. The mother hugged her daughter close, whispering frantically for her to stop. But the girl looked past her mother, her eyes fixed firmly on the accused man sitting at the defense table. She didn't understand the word trial, or the consequences of guilt or innocence. All she knew was that she had seen him before, and the dog had been with him. The accused shifted uncomfortably, his usually confident demeanor cracking. For the first time, sweat glistened on his brow. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but the man's eyes kept darting toward the child, as though she had stripped him bare with nothing but a finger pointed in his direction. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, watching. He didn't need to ask the child a single question. Her words had already planted seeds that would grow on their own. The jurors would carry them, replay them, and measure every new piece of evidence against them. What had started as innocent pointing and laughter had become something far more dangerous to the defense: suspicion. And suspicion was often the spark that lit the fire of conviction. The canine shifted once more, sitting taller, eyes unblinking. Its handler whispered a quiet command, but the dog's focus refused to break. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't random. The dog remembered, just as the child did. The courtroom pressed on, motions filed, objections raised, questions asked and answered. But beneath it all, the atmosphere had changed. What had once been a battle of facts and testimonies now carried an undercurrent of instinct, innocence, and recognition. The jury wasn't just weighing evidence anymore. They were weighing the unshakable honesty of a child and the unwavering instincts of a dog. And slowly, suspicion grew into something more. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence that had followed the child's last words. Everyone inside the courtroom felt it, the subtle but undeniable shift. Where once there had been laughter at a toddler's antics, there was now a tightening in the air, a tension that made every whisper seem like thunder. The prosecutor sat straighter, pen resting idle on his notes. He had sensed it earlier, but now it was undeniable. The girl's interruption wasn't just a disruption. It was a thread. And in a courtroom, even the thinnest thread could pull open hidden seams. The judge cleared his throat, voice louder than necessary, as if trying to regain authority over a room that had slipped beyond his control. "We will proceed with evidence," he said. "The jury is reminded to focus only on admissible testimony." His eyes flicked toward the child, then quickly back to his bench. But it was too late. Everyone had already heard her. The defense attorney rose, visibly irritated. His suit was immaculate, but the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead betrayed him. He wanted to crush the growing suspicion before it spiraled further. "Your Honor," he began, voice tight but sharp, "what we just witnessed was nothing more than the imagination of a toddler. To give it weight is absurd. Children at that age, the prosecutor interrupted smoothly, standing at once, are often incapable of elaborate lies. Their words come raw, unfiltered. Which makes them," he paused, deliberately letting the silence carry, "remarkably honest." The jury's eyes flickered, between the two men like spectators at a tennis match. The defense attorney bristled. "Honest, perhaps, but unreliable. What she thinks she saw is irrelevant." The prosecutor's lips curled into something between a smile and a challenge. "Irrelevant? Let's test that." He turned to the witness stand, where the canine's handler still sat, hands folded on the table. "Officer, please confirm again. Where was your dog deployed in the weeks before the arrest?" The officer reached for his logbook, flipping carefully. "We patrolled Oakwood Street 3 times in the span of 2 weeks. The defendant was observed in the area on 2 of those nights. Oakwood Street." The jurors' pens scratched at notepads. A few heads turned toward the child again, as if seeking reassurance from her small, steady face. The prosecutor nodded. And during those patrols, did your canine show any reaction consistent with recognition or alerting? Yes, sir, the handler replied. Each time, the dog indicated heightened awareness near a residence and along the alley behind it. Do you have a record of that? Yes, it's in the patrol notes. The prosecutor approached the bench, holding up a document. Exhibit 27, Your Honor. Patrol logs from the Oakwood deployments. The judge accepted it with a nod, though his face betrayed a flicker of unease. He knew what was happening. The girl's words, once dismissed as childish chatter, were lining up with official records. What had seemed laughable minutes ago now felt undeniable. The defense attorney leapt up, voice rising. Objection. We cannot allow the ramblings of a 3-year-old to dictate this case. The patrol logs stand on their own merit. There is no need to drag this courtroom into the realm of fairy tales. The prosecutor's voice cut back like a blade. Fairy tales don't align with patrol records. Counselor. He turned to the jury, letting the weight of that statement hang. Coincidence, perhaps? Or truth spoken in the only way a child knows how? Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, hushed but powerful. A woman in the gallery pressed her hand over her mouth, whispering something to the man beside her. Even the bailiff, who had seen dozens of trials, shifted on his feet. The judge's gavel came down. Order! There will be no more interruptions from the gallery. But order was gone. The accused shifted in his chair, his face a mask of forced calm, but his restless hands betrayed him. His lawyer leaned close, whispering furiously, but the man's gaze kept straying to the little girl. Her presence unnerved him in a way no seasoned prosecutor ever had. She was not there to prove a point. She was simply telling what she saw, and the purity of that made his defense feel paper-thin. The K9 stirred again. Its ears pricked, its body leaned forward, and with a faint whine, it pressed its paw against the handler's boot. The sound was quiet, almost imperceptible, but for those close enough, it was chilling. The dog remembered. The prosecutor didn't miss it. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, pacing slowly before them, you've been told to consider facts. And you will. But facts are sometimes buried under layers of deception. What cuts through that deception are moments like this, a child's unfiltered truth, a dog's undeniable instinct. Separate, they may seem fragile. Together, they reveal something we can't ignore. The defense attorney barked an objection, but it was drowned out by the murmurs that surged again. Even the judge's gavel struggled to contain it this time. The child, sitting on her mother's lap, leaned forward slightly, her tiny hand pointing once more at the dog. Her voice carried clear, not shouting, not whispering, but certain. That's him. That's the doggy. He was there. Gasps filled the room. The prosecutor didn't speak. He didn't need to. The jury's eyes widened, their pens frozen mid-scratch. The mother tried to hush her daughter again, but the little girl didn't look away from the K9, and the K9 didn't look away from her. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law and argument. It had become something else, a stage where innocence and instinct had collided with cold, hard facts. The defense attorney slumped slightly, realizing the tide had turned. He would keep fighting. Of course, he had no choice. But the room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the child and the dog, bound together by a truth that no ridicule could erase. The transformation was complete. The courtroom had changed. No one could deny it anymore. The child's words, once brushed off as adorable nonsense, had grown roots in the minds of everyone present. Jurors shifted uneasily. Attorneys scribbled notes faster than they could think, and even the judge's steady gavel couldn't flatten the unease, pulsing through the chamber. The accused sat rigid at the defense table, jaw tight, eyes darting from the child to the K9. He had faced police questioning, interrogations, and evidence laid out like weapons against him. But nothing rattled him like the stare of that little girl, steady, certain, and impossibly pure. The prosecutor stood slowly, sensing momentum. His tone was calm, almost conversational, but the weight of his words landed heavily. We've heard the child's statement. We've also seen the patrol logs that placed this K9 in our neighborhood during nights when the defendant was reported nearby. He paused, letting the jury feel the alignment of facts and innocence. Now let's see what happens when we test those claims further. He called forward a second officer, one of the detectives assigned to neighborhood patrol during the investigation. The man walked with the slow, practiced steps of someone who'd been in courtrooms before. He swore his oath and sat, posture straight, voice firm. "Detective," the prosecutor began, "were you present during the K9 deployments in the Oakwood neighborhood?" "Yes, sir. I accompanied the handler on 2 of the 3 nights." "And what did you observe?" The detective glanced briefly toward the child before answering. "The dog alerted twice in the same general area. One of those times was behind a row of houses along Oakwood Street. We investigated but found no immediate evidence linking the suspect directly." The prosecutor nodded. "But the dog reacted?" "Yes, both times." He paced a step closer to the jury, his voice steady but sharp. "Members of the jury, you've now heard this. A child recognizes this very dog from her street, describing him being present with a bad man. The official patrol logs show the dog was indeed there. And a detective has confirmed the dog alerted in that very area. These aren't coincidences. These are converging truths." The defense attorney sprang to his feet. "Objection. This is outrageous. This so-called testimony is being built on the ramblings of a toddler. Are we to let a preschooler dictate justice?" The judge's gavel cracked against the desk. Sustained in part. "Counselor, watch your tone. The jury will decide what weight, if any, to place on the child's statement." The prosecutor didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer to the witness stand, lowering his voice so that the jurors had to lean in to catch his words. "Detective, when the K9 alerted behind those houses, did you make note of which residences were nearby?" "Yes. One of them belonged to the Johnson family." The courtroom rustled. The mother gasped softly in the back row. That was their home, the very house where the little girl lived. The prosecutor let the silence linger, then continued, "So to be clear, the K9 alerted in direct proximity to the child's home. And now that same child has identified this dog as the one she saw during those nights." The defense attorney slammed his folder shut, rising again. "Circumstantial at best. There is no photographic evidence, no recordings, no." But the prosecutor cut him off, turning sharply. "And yet, the child's memory lines up with the official record. What are the odds of a 3-year-old fabricating a story that just happens to align with police logs she's never seen?" The defense attorney faltered. His mouth opened, but no words came. He sat back down, defeated for the moment. The jury was no longer passive. They leaned forward, brows furrowed, pens scratching notes feverishly. They weren't weighing only the lawyer's words now. They were weighing innocence itself. The K9 let out another soft whine, shifting on its paws. Its handler stroked its back, but the dog's eyes remained locked on the child. The connection was almost eerie, as if the dog were confirming every word she spoke without a single human sentence. The prosecutor seized the opportunity. He turned toward the handler again. "Officer, does your dog display recognition behaviors?" "Yes, sir. These dogs are trained to remember scents. If they've encountered someone or something significant before, they often react when they encounter it again. Would you say the behavior we've witnessed in this courtroom, the focus on that child, fits that description?" The officer hesitated. The room leaned in. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, I would." A ripple spread through the gallery. The jury's pens scratched louder. The defense attorney paled. The prosecutor let out a breath, then addressed the room as though speaking directly to the conscience of each juror. The law relies on facts. But sometimes, facts don't come to light until innocence demands they be seen. Tonight, we see it through a child's eyes and a dog's loyalty. Together, they remember what the rest of us overlooked. The judge cleared his throat, visibly struggling to remain impartial. "We will recess for today," he announced, banging his gavel once more. "Court will resume tomorrow morning." Chairs scraped against the floor as people rose. Conversations buzzed instantly, low whispers turning into urgent chatter. The jurors filed out under strict instruction not to discuss the case, but their expressions betrayed them. They had already been moved. The mother gathered her daughter quickly, holding her close as though to shield her from the weight of what had unfolded. But the little girl wasn't scared. She smiled faintly, pointing once more at the K9 before whispering, "He remembers too." The handler froze, goosebumps prickling his arms. The dog's ears perked. The connection between child and K9 was undeniable now, a bridge built on memory and innocence that no objection could tear down. The accused was led away in silence, but his eyes lingered on the girl until the last possible second. For the first time since his arrest, fear crept into his expression. It wasn't fear of the prosecutor, or the evidence, or the jury. It was fear of a child's voice, one that had pierced his lies more effectively than any investigation. By the time the courtroom emptied, the transformation was complete. What had once been dismissed as childish chatter had become a cornerstone of truth. The child's words were no longer background noise. They were evidence. The following morning, the courthouse felt different. The usual shuffle of feet and murmurs in the gallery carried a charged anticipation, as though everyone knew they were not walking into just another day of proceedings, but into something far more pivotal. The story of the child in the K9 had spread through whispers in the hallways and across headlines in local papers. Though the judge had ordered discretion, people talked anyway. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. The jury filed in, eyes sharper now, not the distracted expressions they wore days earlier. Each of them had gone home with the image of a little girl pointing at a dog and saying words that refused to fade. "That's the doggy." He was there. No instruction to ignore it could undo the honesty they had witnessed. The defense attorney arrived early, his jaw tight, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. He knew the ground beneath him had shifted. The jurors no longer viewed the child's statements as a distraction. They had begun to treat them as truth. His task now wasn't just to defend his client, it was to undo innocence itself. And that was nearly impossible. The prosecutor, by contrast, carried himself with measured calm. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, but the spark in his eyes betrayed quiet confidence. He had facts. Now he also had something stronger, a jury that wanted to believe the child. The judge took his seat, striking the gavel once. Court is back in session. The defense attorney rose quickly, wasting no time. "Your Honor, before we continue, I request the jury be reminded again that a toddler's comments are not admissible testimony. We cannot allow sentiment to outweigh reason. This is a court of law, not a stage for nursery tales." His words echoed sharply, but their effect was the opposite of what he hoped. Jurors frowned, their eyes flicking toward the small figure seated in the back row with her mother. The child's innocence didn't look like a nursery tale. It looked like truth wrapped in simplicity. The judge sighed. "The jury has been reminded. Proceed." The prosecutor stood. "Thank you, Your Honor. The state would like to call an expert witness in child psychology." A middle-aged woman approached the stand, confident and composed. She took the oath and sat, her hands folded neatly. "Doctor," the prosecutor began, You specialize in early childhood cognition and memory? Yes, she replied. I've spent over 20 years studying how young children perceive and recall events. In your professional opinion, are children capable of fabricating detailed lies that align with unrelated facts, such as official patrol records they've never seen? The doctor shook her head. At that age, children are concrete thinkers. They speak what they've observed or felt. They lack the capacity for deliberate deception tied to external data. If this child recognized the dog and described seeing it near her home, it is highly likely that she truly did. The jury scribbled furiously. The defense attorney shot to his feet. Doctor, are you suggesting children are incapable of lying? Not incapable, she clarified. But when they do lie, it is usually transparent about trivial matters, like denying they ate a cookie. Complex lies, especially those aligning with external, verifiable events, are extraordinarily rare in children this age. The prosecutor stepped closer. So in your professional judgment, the child's recognition of the K9 and her statement about a bad man near her home, are those statements likely fabricated? The psychologist looked toward the little girl, who sat swinging her legs gently, unaware of the weight her words carried. No, she said firmly. I believe she's telling the truth as she experienced it. The defense attorney clenched his fists. He had expected a challenge, but this expert's calm certainty only deepened the juror's conviction. Then came the moment that tipped the balance further. The prosecutor asked the handler to bring the K9 forward. The dog padded confidently into the center of the courtroom, tail low but steady, eyes alert. The handler gave a quiet command, and the dog sat obediently, gaze fixed forward. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecutor said, you've heard words. Now let's observe instinct. He gestured toward the mother and child. Hesitant, the mother carried her daughter to the front. The little girl's eyes lit up at once. Doggy? She whispered, wriggling until her feet touched the floor. She toddled forward, tiny hand reaching out. The K9 didn't move at first, but then its ears perked, and with a low whine, it leaned forward, sniffing the air. Slowly, it extended its nose until it brushed the girl's hand. Then, to the astonishment of the room, the trained police dog, usually stoic and reserved, let out a soft, rumbling sound and wagged its tail. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. The jury leaned forward. Even the judge's eyebrows rose. The child beamed. See? He remembers me. The handler swallowed hard, visibly moved. This isn't standard behavior, he admitted. This dog only shows that kind of recognition when there's a memory tied to scent or presence. He knows her. The defense attorney scrambled, shouting, "This is theatrics. Pure manipulation." But the jury wasn't listening to him anymore. They were watching a bond unfold before their eyes, a connection between a child and a dog that no one could script. The little girl turned then, pointing across the room, her finger landing squarely on the accused. "And that's the bad man." The room erupted. Some gasped. Others whispered fiercely. The accused shifted violently in his chair, his lawyer grabbing his arm to keep him from standing. The K9 growled low, body tense, as though it too recognized the man. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly. Order! Order in this courtroom. But order was gone. The emotional tide had turned fully. The defense attorney, pale and rattled, tried to recover. "Your Honor, I demand this be stricken from the record. This child doesn't know what she's saying." The judge's voice wavered as he barked back. "Sit down, counselor." For the first time, sympathy and respect filled the jurors' expressions, not for the defense, not for the prosecution, but for the child. She hadn't taken the stand. She hadn't been sworn in. But she had spoken truth with a clarity that no adult could rival. As the mother scooped her daughter back into her arms, The gallery erupted into hushed discussion. A prosecutor let the silence speak for him. He didn't need another word. The emotional turning point was complete. A 3-year-old girl and a loyal canine had shifted the weight of justice with nothing but memory and instinct. And the jury had seen it with their own eyes. The courtroom the next morning felt like a sealed chamber of tension. Every person in the gallery knew the trial had reached its peak. The events of the day before still echoed, an innocent child pointing with fearless clarity, a police dog growling in recognition, a jury witnessing truth laid bare in a way no evidence file could rival. The jurors entered, their faces unreadable but heavy with the weight of responsibility. Some held their notepads tighter than usual. Others avoided looking directly at the accused. It was clear they had spent a long, restless night replaying the child's words in their minds. The accused sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the jury with a mix of defiance and dread. His defense attorney whispered furiously to him, flipping through papers as though searching for one last miracle. But miracles were gone. The tide had turned, and both of them knew it. The judge entered, gavel striking once. Court is in session. The jury has deliberated. Before we hear the verdict, are there any final statements from either side? The prosecutor rose calmly. No further words, Your Honor. The truth has spoken louder than I ever could. The defense attorney stood reluctantly. His voice was thin, desperate. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have been misled by emotion. This case was never about a child's imagination or a dog's instincts. It was about facts. And facts cannot be replaced by sentiment. If you allow yourselves to be swayed by innocence and theatrics, then justice will not be served. I beg you set aside the distraction and remember your duty. His words fell flat. Not a single juror nodded. Not a single face softened. It was as though his plea dissolved into the stale air of the room, leaving only silence behind. The bailiff called for order as the foreperson of the jury rose, holding the folded slip of paper that carried the weight of everything. The judge asked, Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? We have, Your Honor. The paper was passed forward, unfolded, and read aloud in a voice that seemed to echo against the wooden walls. On the charge of kidnapping and assault, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A gasp erupted from the gallery. The accused slammed his fists against the table, shouting protests, his lawyer trying to restrain him. This is a sham. You can't do this. That brat, she's lying. His voice cracked with rage, but the jury didn't flinch. The canine rose instantly, barking once, sharp and commanding. The sound cut through the chaos like a blade. The handler tightened his grip on the leash, but the dog's stance made one thing clear. It would protect that child, no matter what. The judge banged his gavel furiously. Order! Order in this court! The verdict has been given. The defendant will be remanded into custody immediately. 2 deputies rushed forward, shackling the man as he cursed, his words bitter but powerless. The chains rattled louder than his voice. For the first time, the weight of his crimes pressed fully upon him. He wasn't leaving that courtroom as a free man. As the noise settled, the prosecutor allowed himself a small exhale, his eyes moving toward the back row, where the child sat in her mother's lap. She didn't understand the full gravity of what had happened, but she sensed the shift. Her little hand clapped together in delight, as if the barking dog had been part of a game. Doggie's happy, she whispered softly. The handler's eyes misted. Yes, sweetheart. He is. The jury members filed out, many of them stealing glances at the little girl. Some offered faint smiles. Others brushed away tears. They had come in skeptical, hardened by rules and logic, but they left as witnesses to something purer. Truth delivered not through legal jargon, but through innocence and loyalty. The prosecutor approached the mother and daughter quietly, lowering his voice. "You both did something remarkable. You reminded this court that truth has many forms. Sometimes the smallest voices speak the loudest." The mother, tears streaking her cheeks, squeezed his hand. "We didn't do it alone. That dog?" He gave her courage. The handler knelt down, so he was eye level with the child. The canine sat obediently at his side, tail wagging gently. The girl reached out, patting the dog's head. "Good doggy," she whispered. And then, with the solemnity only a child could carry, she added, "Thank you." The dog leaned into her tiny hand, a gesture so simple, yet so profound it silenced everyone nearby. No one doubted that the animal remembered her, remembered that night, and recognized the man who had done wrong. In the days that followed, news outlets across the country carried the story. Headlines read, "Toddler and police dog change course of trial," and "Innocence and instinct lead to conviction." Legal analysts debated the ethics of allowing such moments in court, but public sentiment was clear justice had been served, and it had taken the combined strength of a child and a dog to make it happen. The defense filed appeals, arguing the trial had been tainted by emotional manipulation. But one by one, those appeals failed. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury's decision was unshakable. Months later, a quiet ceremony was held at the police department. The K-9 received a special commendation, not for finding drugs or chasing down suspects, but for something rarer, reminding a courtroom that loyalty and memory can speak truth. The mother and child attended the ceremony. The little girl, now a bit older, wore a small dress and clutched a ribbon given to her by the officers. She didn't fully understand why everyone was clapping, but when the dog trotted forward and barked once, she giggled and clapped too, as though sharing a secret only the two of them knew. The handler, holding back emotion, bent down to the girl. "He'll never forget you," he said softly. "And I won't forget him," she replied, her words innocent but resolute. The prosecutor, watching from a distance, felt a quiet satisfaction. He had fought cases before. He would fight many again. But this one would never leave him. Not because of the paperwork or the verdict, but because of the moment when truth had come from the purest source imaginable. Years later, people would still tell the story. They would speak of the little girl who pointed at a dog and said two words that shattered the defense. "He remembers." They would tell of a courtroom silenced by innocence, of a K-9 who growled at a guilty man without needing evidence or argument. And those who had been there would never forget the sight of justice, unfolding in the simplest of forms, a child's honesty and a dog's loyalty proving stronger than any lie. In the end, it wasn't just a case. It was a reminder that truth doesn't always arrive in polished statements or long testimonies. Sometimes it comes from the unshakable bond between a child and a dog, pure, fearless, and undeniable.